Welcome to this presentation of Ask UAS. Ask UAS, where Ketchikan finds answers. Ask UAS is an event series put on by the UAS Ketchikan Campus Library and is being streamed live via Facebook Live. The video will remain available on our Facebook page for later viewing and will eventually be uploaded to the UAS Ketchikan YouTube page. This lecture is entitled Strategic Failure, the Aleutian Campaign in World War II, and our speaker tonight is Dr. John Radzilowski. You are encouraged to put your questions in the chat box, and one of our staff will read them off as appropriate throughout the presentation. Our speaker today is our very own professor of history. He has a PhD from Arizona State University, and he specializes in modern U.S. history, Russia, Eastern Europe, and public history. He has taught history, art history, and geography at UAS on the Ketchikan campus since 2007. Prior to moving to Alaska, he taught history courses at the University of St. Thomas, Hamline University, and Anoka Ramsey College in Minnesota. He's also served as assistant project director at the Center for Nations in Transition at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where he helped design and administer the USAID and State Department-sponsored training programs for business, economics, and political science faculty, as well as NGO leaders in Ukraine and East Central Europe. His research and teaching interests are wide-ranging and diverse: immigration and ethnicity, military history, war and genocide, the impact of technology on the history and geography of the Great Plains and the Midwest, local and regional studies, and the history of Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Central and Eastern Europe. He is a published author and often makes appearances in the media, including, most recently, the Polish edition of Newsweek. So with that in mind, I will go ahead and turn it over. Please go ahead and wow us with your information today.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone who's joining us live, as well as anyone who will be watching this later on. We're very pleased that even though we're in the sort of virus protection mode here, we're still able to provide some programming. And tonight we're going to talk about the Aleutian campaign in the Second World War. And it's obviously, we're here in Alaska. It's a topic close to our hearts in some ways. In the past, we've done a couple other UAS presentations on topics related to this. We had one a few years ago on Aleutian deportation, which was also part of the World War II story in Alaska, and also the Japanese deportation from Southeast Alaska. So I'm not going to be covering those topics tonight. However, if you have questions about those topics and anything else related to Alaska in the Second World War or Second World War more generally, you're certainly free to ask those as well. So any questions that you have are certainly welcome. But today we're going to talk about the actual military campaign that was conducted in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands Campaign. And its implications, and I've titled this Strategic Failure, because as a historian, one of the things that interests me the most is how people come to the decisions in the past that they made. What kind of information did they have? What was their worldview that led them to take the actions that they did or make the decisions that they did? And when you look at something like the Aleutian campaign, this is a big question. So why the Aleutians? Why was there a military campaign in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska? And by the way, we are, for some of you who are maybe joining us outside of Alaska, we are in Ketchikan, which is pretty much the opposite side of Alaska. It's a very long distance. We are not close to the Aleutians at all. And it's even today very hard to get there. Attu and Kiska, where the Japanese occupied for a better part of a year, is a very remote area and very hard to get to even today with modern transportation, modern technology, even more so in the 1940s. So why the Aleutians? It's a remote area, it's an unlikely place, and actually just being there is difficult. Now, Native people lived there for countless generations, and they adapted, living in small communities. But to conduct a modern military campaign, especially with the technology of the 1940s, was extremely difficult. So why was this even attempted? What was the point of all of this? The other thing we should note, and I say this advisedly, and by the way, my great uncle served in the Aleutian campaign. My great uncle Tom, who passed away a few years ago. Then he was transferred off to Europe later on and served in the European theater. But he actually served in this campaign, and there's certainly some veterans of this that may be still alive. But in the end of the day, the Aleutian campaign had virtually no impact on the outcome of the Second World War. So in other words, whether or not the campaign had taken place or not really wouldn't have changed the outcome of the war, or would have changed it in some very, very minor way. The casualties of this campaign, especially on the American side, were fairly high given the fact that this was a relatively remote area. In fact, a lot of the casualties, as we'll see later on, are caused by the weather conditions. The Americans lose more aircraft to terrain and weather than they do to enemy action. There are more American soldiers lost or injured on Attu due to the weather conditions, due to the terrain conditions that they experienced. They were lost to, or wounded by enemy action. There was no benefit for the Japanese, and we're going to try to look at the Japanese side of this quite a bit tonight. And there was really no benefit in the end for the Americans. So why did this take place? That's kind of what we'll try to look at. So let's flip to the next slide, if we will. And we'll talk a little bit about why the Japanese decided to invade the Aleutian Islands. And this, we have to take a little bit of a dive, a little bit of a detour here into the way the Japanese kind of saw the world in the 1930s and 1940s and how they came to make decisions like, should we go to the war with the UAS? And of course, this is Pearl Harbor week, or it was earlier this week. And so that was obviously an extremely momentous decision. It's been questioned quite a bit by historians. And if we look at the Aleutian campaign, it's sort of a little bit of a sidelight, but it gives us sort of a little bit of a window into what the Japanese thinking was, such as it is, and how they came to make decisions like, should we go to Alaska and invade these islands or not? So here we have a little diagram up on the screen, and there's a lot of arrows and pictures, and so we'll look at how do the Japanese make decisions, strategic decisions, and I'm calling this strategic failure because this really was a failure of strategy. And we talk about usually military historians and I'm going to simplify this quite a bit. Military historians tend to look at three levels of activity in military activities. They look at a tactical level, which is the sort of individual soldiers and the small groups of soldiers. How do they accomplish their tasks? Then there's the operational level, which is how military operations are actually planned. And then there's the strategic level, which is sort of the if you will, the bird's eye view of everything from 10,000 feet of what is the overall goal of all of these military operations. What are they trying to achieve for the benefit of that particular country or of that particular group? So we're looking at that sort of top level here. We're not looking so much at the lower level. And we should say that the Japanese armed forces were very competent in their tactics and their operations. They were very well trained. They were very dedicated. The attack on Pearl Harbor is a good example. The Japanese were very good at launching military operations and doing so successfully. However, they were not so good when it came to strategy. And here's where things started to break down. Now on the diagram, we have the sort of diagram of how the Japanese leadership was making decisions during this time period. And of course, we have the emperor at the top, the Showa Emperor Hirohito. And Hirohito is technically the head of the Japanese government. He's the head of the Japanese state. He's the emperor. And in the imperial system prior to and during the Second World War, the emperor was a divine figure. He was literally the descendant of the sun goddess, and as such, he was infallible. He could not make mistakes. So the problem of this was, as the Japanese system developed, is that, of course, governments make mistakes. Policies go awry, things go wrong. And so the emperor could not be held responsible for the decisions made by the government. So the emperor was insulated from the decision-making process. He would approve in a sort of general way the government and the operations of the military, but he was kept out of the loop for most of the vital information. He was kind of given summaries at some times, but he didn't have a direct role in any of the decision-making that went on. He worked through something called the Privy Council, which is a council made up of leading aristocrats that were advisors to the emperor, and they would communicate some things to the government, and the government would communicate things back to the emperor sometimes, but it was mostly very indirect. So the emperor is really not in the picture in terms of deciding how things are going to shake out in terms of the military or the political strategy. He's sort of sitting up above all of these decisions. Now, Japan had a parliament as well. They had an elected parliament. The parliament really didn't have a lot of decision-making authority over the government, especially by the 1930s, where Japan is becoming more authoritarian. The parties simply don't exercise a great deal of control. So unlike a lot of governments, the Japanese cabinet, the ministers, the prime minister, the foreign minister, the ministers of all the different branches of the government are not necessarily drawn from the parliament. They can be drawn from anywhere. They're approved by the emperor. He can, as in any constitutional monarchy, he can dissolve the government. But they're not really drawn from the parliament. They're just drawn from groups of people that have similar interests. And throughout most of the first part of the Second World War, the cabinet, the prime minister of Japan was an army general, and his name was Hideki Tojo. He's sort of most associated with Japan's move to war in the early 1940s. And then we have the Army and the Navy. Now here's where things start to get really kind of strange, because the Army and the Navy are not under the control of the government directly. Their loyalty is directly to the emperor himself, even though the emperor, as we've mentioned, doesn't really have decision-making authority and doesn't try to exercise decision-making authority. But their loyalty is to the government. They do not have to obey the dictates of the cabinet or the government. Okay. Now, there's a minister for the Navy and a minister for the Army that sit in the government. They're part of the cabinet, but they are not. They are appointed by the Army minister is appointed by the Army. The Navy minister is appointed by the Navy. So in effect, the Army and the Navy are independent of the rest of the government. And if they don't like what the government's doing, their minister will simply resign and the government will fall. The Japanese government has to have a minister from the Army and the Navy to be a legal government. Okay, so if the Army and the Navy don't like what the government's doing, they just pull their minister and the government collapses, a new government has to be formed. So they basically have veto power over anything that the government tries to do. And of course, they're competing with one another. The Army and the Navy both want resources, they both want to call the shots, and they're both developing strategies for what they think ought to be done. And of course, their goal is military conquest, because they're set up to, that's what they're set up to do, that's what they're trained to do. So there's really very little restraint on the military in that sense. And of course, it's symbolized by the fact that the prime minister is himself an army general. Now, if you followed all of that, I probably didn't do a very good job. I probably simplified it too much because it's very confusing. If you look at this picture, you go, well, what is he talking about? And it is confusing. This is part of the problem. But let me make you more confused. If you're not confused enough, we'll make you more confused. Because there's another problem, is that the Army and the Navy are themselves divided within their own ranks. There's junior officers and senior officers, and the junior officers are often the ones calling the shots. the senior officers are often afraid to actually contradict or discipline the mid and junior officers in their own ranks. And the younger officers tend to be very radical. They tend to be very bellicose. They're very interested in war, and they have a lot of public support. And so this is how Japan actually starts to get into military conflicts. In China in 1932 and again in 1937, it's local officers, in some cases they are colonels or captains, who decide to start fighting they march their troops across the border and attack or fire across the border and attack Chinese forces on the other side of the border. And so and once they start the war, the government ends up backing them up. And why do they do that? Because they're afraid of those younger officers. There's a tradition in Japan, particularly by the 1930s, of very radical nationalists who are intent on expanding Japanese control, and many of them, again, are junior officers, and they are willing to use violence against anyone who goes against them. So there's a number of government ministers who try to bring the armed forces under control. There are generals who try to bring their younger officers under control, and they are attacked by assassins, usually with swords. In some cases they're killed, in some cases they're maimed for life. The assassins are usually caught, sometimes they're executed, sometimes they're let off with just a slap on the wrist. But they get a lot of popular support, even though they're going against their senior officers. So the military structure is very strange compared to what we would think of today. And the results of this become pretty clear even before Pearl Harbor. In 1937, Japan starts a war with China and invades nationalist China. This is again the result of younger officers who take the initiative there's no central planning. Okay, so we're thinking about strategy, right? What's the strategy for our war with China? Well, there isn't a very clear one. And so they get into this war, and the Japanese armed forces are very good. Now, if you've read any accounts of the Second World War, you might have read about how basically the Japanese forces won all victories against China. It's not exactly true. Chinese forces put up tremendous resistance to the Japanese. The Japanese outgunned them. They were better led in some cases, more mobile. But the Chinese forces, especially the nationalist forces, put up tremendous resistance. Before the first bombs drop on Pearl Harbor, Japan has already suffered 1 million casualties. They've lost 1 million men. This is, again, something that's sort of forgotten in the Second World War. And what's worse, they can't get out of the war. They can't stop the war. They try to make peace with the Chinese. They try to bring Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists to the peace table. Chiang Kai-shek says, no way. I'm not going to do it. And this is one of the things that leads directly to war with the United States. Because as Japan keeps, in a sense, this becomes like a quagmire. If we think about, our own experiences, perhaps in Vietnam and other places, we win lots of battles. And the Japanese certainly win lots of battles in China, but they cannot win the war. They cannot bring the war to a close. And the more they try to bring the war to a close, the more they get involved with other powers like the British, the Dutch, the French, and ultimately the Americans. Because they keep trying to cut off supplies to Chiang Kai-shek. This is why they invade Indochina, send their forces into French Indochina in 1940. And this is one of the things that starts the Americans putting sanctions on the Japanese, which in turn, we won't go through the full account of how the war comes about, but this essentially starts the clock ticking toward Pearl Harbor. Okay, so this lack of a clear, decisive, a clear strategy is really harmful to Japan, and it really begins to involve it in wars that ultimately cannot finish. In the case of the U.S., can't win. Now. So if you got all that, that sort of shows you this is a very, it's one of the really interesting things about this is that we tend to think of, we look back on the past and we tend to think of the past leaders as having a clear vision, a clear strategy, but often they don't. and this is the case, Japan in a way, backs into war with the United States. Even though the Japanese leaders are very clear, most of them, they're not fools. They can look at the the statistics. They see the U.S. as a bigger country, it's a stronger country, has more resources. This is not something that they can necessarily win, but they eventually convince themselves that perhaps they can fight the Americans hard enough and cause the Americans enough casualties so the Americans will stop fighting and make peace with them. Kind of the same way that they had approached the situation in China, but of course, once again, this is more hope. This isn't a strategy. This is a hope. As they say, hope is not a plan, and this is not a plan. So, of course, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launch a preemptive strike against Pearl Harbor, and they decide if they're going to go to war with the U.S., they might as well go to war now, because the U.S. is getting stronger. I want to flip to the larger map there. This is a sort of overview map of the whole Pacific theater. I give you sort of orient you with Alaska sort of being up there in the top of the map. Essentially, the Japanese are first very successful. A surprise attack, of course, on Pearl Harbor, invasion of the Philippines, defeating the British in Malaysia, and capturing Singapore, capturing the Dutch East Indies. But they're fighting against relatively underpowered and relatively unprepared and weak foes. They're doing it very well. They plan these operations to a T, but again, what's the overall goal? I think it's not entirely clear here. Part of the idea that they have is to create a defensive perimeter, and you see this red dotted line, which is sort of the line of control, the sort of maximum control that Japan had. And the idea was they would capture a series of islands and outposts, they'd fortify them and sort of force the Americans to come dig them out at great cost to the United States. And the U.S. would eventually decide this would be not too, they'd rather just make peace be easier to make peace. Of course, the U.S. isn't going to do that, as we know. And the American, let's look for a second on the American side. What's the American strategy? Of course, the Americans, if we look back to 1939, 1940, when the war is really getting heated up, especially in Europe, most of the focus was on Europe. Most of the focus was on Germany. President Roosevelt wanted to take a much more activist role in world affairs, and so he was certainly very interested in helping the British to fend off Nazi Germany, and that was the main focus. Most Americans and most American leaders assumed that if war was going to begin, it was probably going to be against Germany first. Most of the focus was on Germany. People realized that Japan was also emerging as a threat, particularly by 1939, 1940, and they begin to ramp up defensive preparations throughout the Pacific and in the Philippines. And this is what the Japanese, in a sense, are picking up, and they're responding to that. They say, well, if the Americans are going to start building up their forces, we better attack now because, before they're prepared, and that way we'll have a better chance. Alaska wasn't on very many people's radar screens. It's really not until the Americans start building up the base at Dutch Harbor. They were already planning it by 1936, but really significant resources aren't sent to Alaska until 1940. So it's relatively late prior to Pearl Harbor. And again, most Americans looked at Alaska and thought, well, it's a possibility that war will happen there, but it was considered fairly unlikely. But if it did happen, interestingly enough, keep in mind in 1940 what the world looked like in 1940. The Germans had captured much of Europe. They were allied and being helped by the Soviet Union. And of course, as you know, there's parts of Alaska you can see. You can see Russia from there. So there is that. There was that thought that Russia was not exactly a friendly power to the British and ultimately to the Americans in 1940. Of course, that's going to change in 1941 with the German attack on the Soviet Union. in June of 1941. But up until then, there was a couple of reasons. It wasn't just Japan that we were interested in, but despite that, there wasn't a lot of resources, even though it was much more than it had been before the 1930s during the Depression. Not a lot of government resources were being put into military defense, especially in Alaska. And that continued really up until 1941. There's a ramp up, as I say, in 1940, but still not a lot of resources being devoted. So the war begins, and the American forces are on the defensive. The Japanese severely damage the fleet. And if you could move maybe to the bigger picture there we go. They damage the American fleet at Pearl Harbor pretty severely, but they don't destroy the American aircraft carriers. The American aircraft carriers were one of the things the Japanese Navy needed to destroy. The Battle of the Coral Sea is kind of indecisive, but it sort of stops the Japanese attempt to isolate Australia. And so in the summer of 1942, again, this is about 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese decide to launch an attack on Midway. And here's where we sort of get into the Alaska side of things. Because one of the questions about the Aleutian campaign is, was the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians an attempt to divert American forces from Midway? Because they occur at about the same time. And you'll see this in many of the accounts, the Japanese accounts as well as the American accounts. You'll see this mentioned, that this was meant somehow as a diversion. There's some controversy over this. And again, it's not entirely clear that what the final answer was. And some of the Japanese leaders may have believed that it was a diversion, but others didn't. And the planners for Midway, especially Admiral Yamamoto, were not interested in Alaska at all. Now, the Japanese had their overall plan, their overall operational plan, was to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle. This was an idea they called it a Kantai Kesen, which means decisive naval battle. And the idea was to draw the American fleet, in this case particularly the American carriers, into a major confrontation and destroy them once and for all. They wanted a big decisive battle. That was the way that the Japanese Navy wanted to operate. Now, of course, if they had diverted the American carriers to Midway, they wouldn't have been able to do that. So the question is, why would they divert the American carriers to Midway if they wanted to destroy the American carriers to Alaska, if they wanted to destroy them at Midway? So the attack on Midway is occurring independently of the operation in Alaska. Now, what was the Japanese interest in Alaska? What ultimately led them to? Now, the Japanese had some information about Alaska. They had done some surveys, and there are accounts, it's a little sketchy, some of the accounts are a little sketchy, that Japanese fishermen had been nosing around taking pictures, that some Japanese fishing boats in the Aleutians may have had military officers on them. They got into confrontations with local fishermen. Sometimes shots were fired, and sometimes, according to at least some oral histories, there were people that were actually killed, one side or the other. So that may be true or maybe not. We don't really have the records on that from the Japanese side. But the Japanese probably had some advanced intelligence about at least some of the conditions and at least the basic geography of the Aleutians. Now, the Aleutian Islands are, in theory, as we can see on the map, relatively close to northern Japan. The island of Attu is about 650 nautical miles north of the Kuril Islands and about 1,300 nautical miles from Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island in present-day Japan. In theory, that's within range of a long-range aircraft, an American bomber like a B-24. But the problem, of course, is there's no air bases on Attu or Kiska, and they're as we'll see, very bad places to have. So The Japanese invasion, of course, now the Battle of Midway commences on June the 4th, 1942, and lasts for a couple days. By the 7th of June, the battle's over, the Americans have won. It's one of the most decisive battles in American naval history, and certainly in World War II history. The American carriers and their aircraft destroyed 4 of the main Japanese carriers, inflicted a very heavy defeat, turned back the Japanese attack on Midway, and as a result, the Japanese are placed permanently on the defensive at that point. The invasion of Attu occurs on June the 7th, so most of the battle's over already. So if this was a diversion, why was it still being carried out? Why were they invading? And again, that's not clear. It was an operation that the Japanese had planned. They clearly put some resources and some planning into it. But once the operation got going, they didn't stop it. There was no overall leader that would say, hey, wait a minute, things didn't go well at Midway. We need those forces elsewhere. So they end up committing their forces and invading Attu and Kiska. Of course, there's no American defense there, so they capture the others. A small American naval weather station where the individuals are captured, and of course they take the local Aleutian population down to prison camps in Japan. But essentially, it's a sort of bloodless victory. And of course, one theory is that this was an attempt by the Japanese to sort of save face from their defeat at Midway. They could at least say that they captured some American territory. But again, that doesn't really tell us much about the overall Japanese strategy. Once the Japanese capture Attu and Kiska, the Americans have to do something about it. They can't just let this slide. It's a propaganda issue, of course. It's a public relations issue. But the Americans start to look at this and they say, well, yes, it is possible for us to fly from the Aleutian Islands to northern Japan. So possibly we could launch a military operation that way. So the Japanese set up defenses on both Attu and Kiska, and the Americans begin to build up forces, along with some help from the Canadians, build up forces to try to take those locations back. Now, the problem the Japanese have is this is a very long way away from Japan. From the nearest Japanese outpost in the Kuril Islands is 650 nautical miles away. So they have to get supplies to their troops. Okay, you can capture places, you can win military victories, but to hold on to them, you need to supply your troops with food, with ammunition, with medical supplies, whole host of things. And in fact, this is a big problem the Japanese will have throughout the war. They create all these little garrisons. You see all the map, all the little islands, but they had to garrison all these places, and they had to supply those, and they need ships to do that. And aircraft and a lot of logistics they simply didn't have. So again, this wasn't a particularly well thought out a way to operate. So the Japanese are sending supplies up, and the first major battle that occurs is called the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, which is named for the islands just beyond the Aleutians there. And by the way, I should mention that the Soviet Union during this period was now in the war, was an American ally, was fighting the Germans, but was not at war with Japan. Japan and the Soviet Union were not at war with each other. And so the Soviets were technically neutral in that conflict. One of the very strange things about this period of the Second World War is that the Americans were, of course, sending lots of supplies to the Soviet Union. Lend-Lease aid was really helping, really major assistance to the Soviets to fight Nazi Germany. And some of that was going through Alaska, but a lot of it was sailing across the Pacific. So you had Soviet ships, Soviet flag cargo ships loading up in Seattle, full of supplies, sailing across the Pacific through Japanese waters to Vladivostok and back again. And they were, for the most part, not messed with. The Japanese just let them sail right on through. And so this is a very strange aspect of the war in the North Pacific. So the Japanese are sending supplies up to these islands, and they need ships to do that. They have to escort them. All of this requires resources. The Americans, of course, are trying to interfere with those. And this is what happens on March the 27th, 1943, is a 6-hour kind of running naval battle called the Battle of the Commandorsky Islands. And we have an American flotilla, the cruiser Salt Lake City, the light cruiser Richmond, and 4 destroyers. And they spot a Japanese convoy being escorted by 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, along with a bunch of transport ships. Very confused. Again, weather conditions are very poor. It's late March, in the Bering Sea. Weather conditions are pretty rough. The Americans are badly outgunned. The cruiser Salt Lake City takes heavy damage from Japanese shell fire. But in fact, at one point, the Salt Lake City is dead in the water. Its boilers are out; it can't move. The other American ships end up surrounding it and so covering it with a smoke screen while they divert Japanese attention. But toward the end of the battle, the Japanese are convinced. The Americans are actually firing so many shells that they begin to run out of ammunition, and they begin to fire practice rounds. And these rounds have some chemicals in them that provide a special flash that allows. They're basically used if you're tracking your own gunnery. You want to see where your shells are falling, and these allow you to spot where your shells are landing better. But the Japanese assume that this is actually part of an American air attack, and so they turn around and they go back to Japan, even though they're actually winning the battle. This is actually, by the way, one of the last naval conflicts that is all surface ships, no aircraft involved at all. But the Japanese turn around and they take their supplies with them and go back to Japan. It's at this point the Japanese realize that they've made a terrible mistake. They cannot supply these islands very well at all. And they're soon going to be cut off, and the soldiers that they have there are going to starve, run out of supplies. So they begin to plan to take the garrisons out. They've been there less than a year, and they're ready to decide they need to withdraw them. In the meantime, the Americans are attempting to, are preparing to attack, and they invade Attu on May the 11th, 1943. You can switch to the next slide there. And this is a photograph from the Battle of Attu. This was early invasion, so it begins on May 11th. Conditions are terrible, and this was very early. Later on in the war, the Americans get very good about getting troops on ships, getting them off ships into combat zones. They become very adept at this. Practice makes perfect. But this was early on in that learning curve, and so lots of things go wrong. There's very little knowledge about the weather conditions or the terrain conditions. And so the Americans are not well prepared for this. They have not surveyed the coastal conditions. Some of their ships run aground on uncharted rocks and shoals. They're not able to get their troops off. They're not able to get the supplies off. So the Americans land. Their vehicles. A lot of Attu is made up of muskeg, and so they have these vehicles that are supposed to bring supplies up to the troops. They sink into the muskeg and basically are immobilized. And so the American troops, there's lots of actually photographs. You can go online and look at some of them of Americans basically creating like little wooden sleds to drag their ammunition across the tundra, or across the muskeg rather, up to the front lines. And so a lot of the American troops don't have cold weather equipment. They don't have. Many of them land. They leave their sleeping bags and their tents on the ships, assuming that they're going to be offloaded onto the later in the day, and they're not. And so they're basically caught. They don't have rainproof gear, waterproof gear. So they have leather boots. They have woolen socks. They sink. People sink. Deep into the muskeg. Then there's parts of the island that are still snow covered. And so people start to get trench foot, they start to get frostbite. and there's huge numbers of casualties. And of course, the Japanese are fighting back as well. There are about just a little under 3,000 Japanese on the island who are resisting, and they resist very bitterly. It's weeks of very bitter fighting in these very difficult conditions. And we're fortunate to have, this is a little break, an artifact from that battle. And this is the artifact, and this is a Type 99 Japanese infantry rifle, 7.7 millimeter. And this is property of the American Legion, Joseph Craig American Legion Post Number 3. Thanks to Hunter Davis for bringing it by to show to us. This was picked up on Attu itself, and it's had some wear and tear on it that you can see on the stock. But it's a standard infantry rifle. It's a very interesting artifact from the campaign. And I don't know if we can see this. This is the mark here on the, and that's a chrysanthemum mark. That is the mark of the armor. It's the Japanese imperial symbol. It means this is actually a property of the emperor. This was a very simple weapon, very basic. In the right hands, in the hands of an experienced infantryman, it could be quite lethal. It has a couple interesting features. One of them is it has an anti-aircraft setting. And so Japanese soldiers would be, were trained to use their rifle against aircraft. And so the sight is actually allows for attempting to see the speed of the aircraft. It's got this monopod here, mount. And it's actually rifle's in actually fairly good shape for having survived all of these years. Like I said, it's a very basic weapon, but this was probably manufactured in 1939, so it's a fairly early model. Some of the later models are not as well designed as these early versions. Probably a walnut stock, but a very simple bolt action rifle. But again, in the right hands, it can be very effective. So again, thank you to the American Legion for bringing that by. So it was a very intense and tough battle, like I said. And toward the end, and we know actually quite a bit about this from the Japanese perspective, because there was a document picked up at the end of the campaign, and it was a diary of a Japanese doctor. It was one of the medical doctors. And the interesting thing about this doctor. And his name was, let me see if I pronounce this correctly, Paul Tatsuguchi. And the interesting thing about Paul Tatsuguchi was he was, as his first name indicates, an English speaker. He was a Christian. He had lived in the United States. He and his wife had gone to school in the United States and had very close connections to the United States. And so he keeps this diary throughout the campaign. The last day of the battle, the Japanese forces have been pushed back. They are taking heavy losses, and the Japanese commander decides to launch an all-out, it's called a banzai attack. They launch a final suicide attack and kill as many Americans as they can and sacrifice themselves. This is the final entry on May the 29th, and this is again from the Japanese doctor. Today at 2 o'clock we assembled at headquarters. The field hospital also took part. The last assault is to be carried out. All the patients in the hospital were made to commit suicide. I am only 33 years old and am to die. I have no regrets. One side to the Emperor. I am grateful that I have kept the peace in my soul which Christ bestowed on me at 8 o'clock. I took care of all the patients with a grenade. Goodbye, Takeo, my beloved wife, who loved me to the last. Until we meet again, grant you Godspeed, Nisaka, who just became 4 years old and will grow up unhindered. If I feel sorry for you, Takiko, born in February of this year and gone before seeing your father, well, goodbye, Mitsui, brothers. He greets all of his family. He says the number participating in this attack is a little over 1,000. We'll try to take enemy artillery position. It seems the enemy will make an all-out attack tomorrow. And that's the last entry in the diary. The attack was desperate. It actually broke through the American front line, but was then stopped. Over 2,800 Japanese died. Only 28 were captured. Most of them died either of wounds, and the Japanese soldiers were trained to fight to the end and not surrender at all. Surrender was considered shameful, and this is one of the reasons why they often mistreated prisoners of war, because they figured if you surrendered, you'd lost all of your honor. The Americans lost 549 killed and about a little over 1,100 wounded, but they lost 1,800 to weather conditions, 1,800 casualties to weather conditions, primarily people who were injured, some of them incapacitated. People had parts of their limbs cut off from frostbite. So this was a very, very bitter campaign, and really was not, the Americans assumed that they'd be able to sort of overwhelm the Japanese within 24 hours, and that certainly didn't happen. There were actually Japanese soldiers that continued to sort of wander around the island after the fighting was over, and trying to survive. A few of them were captured, and a lot of them just died. The Japanese were also suffering from exposure as well, by the way. They were certainly not immune to that, but essentially the entire Japanese garrison was wiped out. A little bit after this, the Japanese decide it's time to evacuate the Aleutian Islands, and they evacuate the garrison from Kiska. One of the great successes of the Japanese military was to evacuate Kiska, and they do that at the end of July 1943. The Americans and Canadians storm the beaches at Kiska and find that there's no enemy left, only there's a couple dogs remaining. And so the campaign kind of comes to an end. If you want to flip to the last slide, or the next slide rather, not the last slide. So the question is then, what happens afterwards? What did the Americans do? Well, we've captured the Aleutians. What do we do next? There were American commanders, including General Buckner, who wanted to invade Japan from the north. The problem was, as this photo illustrates, this is a PBY flying boat that has crashed due to weather conditions in 1945, was that while we could launch raids, we certainly launched a few raids from air bases on Adak in particular, but did very little damage. Our aircraft flew to Japan. On many of the raids that Americans launched from Alaska to northern Japan, again, more aircraft were lost to weather conditions. They would sometimes lose 2 or 3 or 4 aircraft to weather conditions and only 1 to enemy fire. Often the cloud cover would be, or there'd be fog. They wouldn't see the target. They didn't know if their bombs were dropped. Quite a few American pilots ended up in Russia. Their aircraft broke down, and they ended up going to Russia, where they were interned in Russia. And so ultimately what the Americans decide is to try to convince the Japanese that there may be an invasion, and try to act as a diversion and keep the Japanese forces in northern Japan for as long as possible. And so really very little happens. Morale was terrible. A lot of American troops were stationed in Alaska. They had some of the worst morale of troops. Again, as Alaskans, this may hurt our heart, but a lot of people wrote some very bad things about having, because basically, they were on these islands. They didn't have, well, not like they had fishing equipment. They could go fishing gear or hunting gear or camping gear, where they could go out and sort of enjoy nature. They were just basically stuck there on these little islands with nothing to do. And there's a whole series of, and this is from a book called Alaska's Hidden Wars, by the way. It's a very interesting book. Covers a number of sort of lesser known aspects. People wrote letters back home saying things like, killing time is going to be my specialty. I'm going to be a bum when this war is over. And another guy writes, nothing ever happens to me. I just stick in the Aleutians and stick and stick and stick. Another guy writes, to talk about being frozen for the duration, I think we're the original icicle that crack was directed at. So, as the war, of course, as the war finishes up, people's morale improves a little bit, but consistently morale for soldiers, sailors, and airmen in Alaska was quite poor. So the results were really nil militarily. A lot of lives were lost, a lot of resources were used. The Americans, by the way, could afford to expend a lot of resources on Alaska. The Japanese couldn't. So really this was a failure on the part of the Japanese, which they managed to sort of at the end rescue by getting a few of their troops out. But really, the whole campaign was predicated on a mistake, on a failure. And this often happens, by the way, in history. Now the silver lining is that this was great for Alaska. The military came in, they built up a tremendous number of airfields, of ports, roads, obviously the Aleutian Highway. They invested a tremendous amount in Alaska. They brought people here, they brought civilian contractors here. They really helped to develop the infrastructure of the state in a way that would never have been developed without the Second World War. So Alaska, in a sense, is the real beneficiary, in some ways the beneficiary of the war. And it really, the war experience and the increase in the population, the increase in the infrastructure that we got, really helps put Alaska on the road to statehood. And so while the overall campaign, certainly from the Japanese perspective, was really one of failure, from the point of view of the state of Alaska, it was actually, we came out, sadly, it took a war to do that, but came out a little bit better than we otherwise would have been. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions.
Well, we have had some running commentary
Okay.
during it, but I didn't want to interrupt you because you were on a great roll.
Okay.
But there's a history major in New York who's
Okay.
kind of new to all this, and she says, so why is this a topic that's not often covered? But maybe it's because she's outside of Alaska, she's not hearing about it. And then these topics started to roll through. They were already talking about the Aleut evacuation, which certainly impacts Ketchikan.
Yes, it does.
And the Aleuts that wound up in Japan.
Yes. Can you flip to the last slide?
And what happened to them. And then, so if you want to talk about that for a minute or two,
Okay.
and then there's another.
Okay. And by the way, for those of you who this is not as widely available as it ought to be, there's a DVD called Aleut Story. We've shown it here at the library. There is a copy at the library, so if you're local or you're a student, you can certainly check it out from us. And it's if you want a good documentary on the Aleut experience, the Aleut evacuation, this is what I would recommend. But why isn't it better known? Partly because a lot of people wanted to forget it. Very often, it didn't result in glorious victories, right? The Americans eventually won, but it was messy. We took a lot of losses. There wasn't any kind of great. There was obviously great heroism on the part of the soldiers, but the generals and the commanders didn't come off quite as well. And certainly the Japanese side the same way. So important. And again, it didn't have a lot of impact on the war, right? There wasn't. If this hadn't happened at all, the Americans still would have defeated the Japanese. So it really wasn't a major campaign for the overall picture of the war. For us in Alaska, it's obviously very important. The Aleut deportation, of course, that's a whole topic. There's a number of books been put out on that. I've written a few little articles on it myself. The residents, the Aleut residents of the Pribilof Islands and the Aleutian Islands were taken and through a variety of, the reasoning behind there was the Interior Department, there was the Territory of Alaska, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Armed Forces really didn't have a clear idea of what to do with the native population. They wanted to remove them. Some wanted to remove them for safety reasons, but they didn't really think it through. They took the Aleut population, about almost 900 people, and moved them to camps in Southeast Alaska. These camps were not very well designed. In many cases, they were former cannery sites, or in cases here in Ketchikan, there's a old civilian conservation corps camp. There was no provision for what people were going to do, for health care, for making a living, and so people were kind of warehoused in those camps, and particularly older people suffered quite a bit. Yet both the older and younger people suffered quite a bit from both the weather conditions and the and health conditions, because contagious diseases broke out. People weren't well fed. Their housing conditions were terrible. Much worse than actually the camps for Japanese Americans. The death rate among Aleuts was much higher actually and although the death rate for Aleuts in Japan was even higher than that. About half the Aleuts that were taken to Japan, which is a smaller number, died in Japan, and only half of them came back. And I think if I'm trying to recall the exact number in the camps in Southeast Alaska, it was more like about 7 or 8%. Whereas for Japanese Americans, it was like less than 1%. The rest of the internment camps that you sort of heard about. But that's actually covered in also the compensation that was given in the. But one of the things though that you see in the Aleut story, by the way, that I didn't fully realize is that a lot of the buildings and the villages, the churches that people had were vandalized by American troops that were stationed on those islands. And often wondered why do people, American soldiers, why do they just sort of randomly wreck people's homes? Well, as you begin to look at the morale that people had, this terrible morale the soldiers had, they were bored, they had nothing to do. You can kind of see, that doesn't justify it, but it certainly helps to explain why, you actually have terrible discipline problems. People start to drink, soldiers start to drink, they don't have anything to do. And so this probably contributed to that problem.
Someone mentioned that they think that those troops came directly from training in California, maybe in the Monterey area. So,
Yeah.
and going out into the Aleutians.
Some of them,
spring.
in fact, some of them had been trained for hot weather conditions. There were quite a few that came from the southern states, completely unclimatized. Mm-hmm. But even locals, if you're out there without the proper equipment or the proper gear, you're in tough shape. So it isn't just it was the lack of equipment. For some of the small communities in Alaska, that we're very isolated. Places like Yakutat, or even some of the bigger towns, where you had all of a sudden hundreds of soldiers show up. It's like the outside world suddenly shows up at your front door, and so it was a huge change for a lot of people, and had a lot of social changes as well that we talked about as well. So it was another question.
Quite a few.
Yeah. So there was some discussion about, again, the strategy in quotation marks of coming into the Aleutian chain. Was it a diversion as the northern anchor or the perimeter? Was it to threaten the United States because now we're on your territory, or maybe perhaps gain favor with the USSR, like, hey, we can
it certainly
win this for you, or open
it
this
certainly
back up?
wasn't the latter.
Okay.
The Japanese had fought campaigns against the Soviet Union as late as 1939, and had actually lost pretty badly in 1939. And they certainly, the last thing they wanted the Soviets to remain as they were. They wanted them to remain neutral. In fact, at the end of the war, the Japanese are hoping that the Soviets will broker a peace deal with the Americans and save their bacon at the last minute. Of course, Stalin has other ideas, and he launches his troops into Manchuria to take over his chunk of territory, and the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin are now Russian territory. Those were Japanese islands prior to the war. So something wasn't for the Russians. They really wanted to make sure that they already were having trouble in China. They were already having trouble in other places. They certainly didn't need the Russians to get involved in one side or the other. And it was clear that the Russians weren't going to go up against the Americans. Certainly not in the Pacific. At least until later on, of course, a different story. Cold War begins, but then the war is over. Again, there's differing accounts. Was it a diversion? We don't know. Some people say yes, some people say no. There are first-person accounts that contradict each other. So again, see, part of the problem is that, and then after the war, you have accounts by people who are trying, Japanese officers, for example, who are trying to justify what happened or trying to explain what happened when they themselves didn't have the full picture. So we have different accounts, and historians have gone back and forth on this. It's not entirely clear because, again, the idea behind Midway was to destroy the American fleet. Well, if you draw the American fleet off to the north to defend the Aleutians, then you're not going to succeed. Again, but again, it really speaks to the mixed, the confusion that the Japanese high command suffered throughout a lot of the war. The lack of knowledge that they had about their opponents, the lack of good intelligence that they had, and also their complete cultural misunderstanding of the Americans, and their misreading of American intentions really throughout, beginning in 1939, 1940, but really continuing up through the end of the war, and the sort of misunderstanding the character of the United States. We often criticize ourselves for not understanding other countries, but that often happens in reverse as well. We're certainly not alone in that respect.
So somebody was wondering if if the Japanese sources characterize this significantly different than what our history would, and then also the same person wondered if there was any residual impact that might have played into the decision to drop the bomb later.
The second, no. The decision to drop the bomb, that's a little easier to sort of characterize than the first part of the question. The decision to drop the bomb was really about what had happened to campaigns in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And also the prospect that the Americans had toward the end of the war was the Japanese were going to keep fighting. The Americans took terrible casualties. The worst, the toughest, probably the worst battle that the Americans ever fought in World War II was Okinawa. And people remember the flag raising at Iwo Jima, and the Marine Corps Memorial, the photographs raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. But we forget that the campaign after that was this terrible, bloody campaign on Okinawa. That Americans suffered huge casualties. We thought we had sort of solved the Japanese, able to defeat the Japanese defenses, but the Japanese on Okinawa resisted. They resisted very, very effectively. And the Americans suffered huge casualties. There was also the prospect that the Japanese civilian population was being trained to fight the Americans en masse or commit mass suicide. And so this had happened on Saipan in particular, where large numbers of Japanese civilians committed suicide. They jumped off cliffs. They basically gathered into a group and pulled a pin on a hand grenade and blew themselves up rather than surrender to the Americans. And so the prospect was that if we were going to go into Japan, and these were small islands, right? This is not a large, relatively small in the case of Okinawa. What if we were going to go in and invade the home islands, the larger home islands with millions of people? Would we have to kill all the civilians? They were training, schoolboys to attack American troops with bamboo spears. Were they going to do that? Was that going to happen? And of course, the Americans were looking at taking 1 million casualties by the end of the war if they were going to invade. If they were going to invade Japan, just the invasion of Japan itself would cost 1 million dead. President Truman was like, no, I don't want. I'd rather try to drop the atomic bomb than. And by the way, the dropping of the atomic bomb was obviously terrible weapons, but the Japanese took more civilian casualties in the firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 than they took in either of the atomic bomb attacks. So as terrible as those were, they were not as bad as some of the other bombing raids. That's often forgotten. How do the Japanese see, how did they see, or how do they see the Aleutian campaign? At the time, it was, again, the Americans hadn't, this was 1943, so the Americans hadn't invaded a lot of Japanese-held islands yet. Guadalcanal was the only one that we'd really invaded. It was spun as a heroic defeat. The Japanese, the claims were the Japanese had inflicted these huge casualties on the Americans. They died gloriously for the emperor, and this was designed as sort of propaganda to show that the Japanese soldiers had done, which they did. They fought. Almost all of them fought to the bitter end, but they greatly inflated the number of American casualties. Today, it's not. It's remembered as part of the Great Pacific War, but it's not a major topic in Japan.
2 more lines of discussion
Okay.
going on. One is just the impact of infrastructure that was built up in Alaska during World War II. How did it impact Europe? Did it have a direct relation to?
To the war in Europe?
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, it didn't have a direct impact. We were obviously funneling aircraft through Alaska to the Soviet Union. It was a major conduit. Now, a lot of the supplies that were going across the Pacific were what we call non-lethal aid. It was food and other, blankets and stuff like that. It wasn't weapons that we were shipping through Japan, but we were shipping aircraft through. So there was a number of bases. There's one close to us here on Annette Island, Annette Lakatla, that was a transfer base. And so essentially the pilots would, and a lot of them were women, by the way, they were, because they employed women to transfer the aircraft up here, and so that the men could then go off and take combat roles. And so they were actually some of the pioneers of aviation in Alaska in that respect. But they would fly up from, they build the planes in places like Seattle, and they get them ready, and they fly them up without armaments to Alaska using a series of relay stations, including, as I said, the one Metlakatla. And then the Soviet pilots would take them over in Fairbanks and then fly them into the Soviet Union. The Soviets did not want Americans flying the aircraft themselves to go into the Soviet Union because they felt the Americans would be spying on them, which is what they were doing, by the way, here in Alaska. There was actually a Soviet spy net in Alaska. We don't know a lot about it, but it does appear in some documents that they were trying to figure out how to influence the Orthodox Church in Alaska and a variety of other things. How effective it was, we don't know. But they did have people who were writing up reports.
Wow. So
in that sense, and of course that was a major conduit for aircraft going to the eastern front of Europe. So that certainly helped the Soviets in that regard. Other than that,
how about Aleutian Highway?
The Aleutian Highway had no effect really whatsoever on Europe. It really wasn't used. It was our first road link to the outside world. And one of the reasons it was built was because there was an idea that all the supplies that would come up to Alaska had to come by sea up until that point. And the thought that the Japanese could put submarines off the coast and basically torpedo those supplies and cut us off, was one of the main purposes for building the Aleutian Highway. Not a lot of supplies went up, or almost no supplies went up during the war, but it became, of course, one of the great highways of the world, one of the great drives of the world, and ultimately, but it's one of the reasons why it was such a good deal for Alaska in the long run, because we got this infrastructure. There was no good economic reason for the Aleutian. And it didn't serve any kind of commercial interests later on. Now it does, but at the time there was no commercial interest in creating that. And so the war conditions were unique, and they helped create that infrastructure that obviously helped the state quite a bit.
And a little more discussion in the professor's opinion. Whose strategic failure was it?
Japanese, primarily. We ended up following along a little bit on that because
Responding.
because we had to respond. And we did not attempt, the attempts to bomb northern Japan from the Aleutians were as close as we came. There were American generals who did think that an invasion of northern Japan from Alaska would have been a good idea. But you have to keep in mind that, first of all, there were so many of the American bombing missions were scrubbed due to weather conditions. They'd get ready, there'd be heavy fog, they couldn't lift off. They had obviously a lot of failure, but also consider how far away these islands are to main bases. You've got large bombers, they require a lot of fuel. They require they require crews. In the case of the B-24 Liberators, a 10-man crew. And you've got even the smaller bombers, the B-25s, they've got 4 or 5-man crew. Plus they need people on the ground to maintain it. You've got to have spare parts. You've got to get armaments, of course. And you've got to get all that supply to these very remote islands. In many cases, it costs more in fuel to get the fuel to these islands than it did use the fuel to fly the aircraft. So it was very costly in terms, and the results were as I mentioned, very limited. They launched a few bombing raids, destroyed a few aircraft, destroyed a few small installations in the Kuril Islands, but for the most part, they just aircraft would go off. They'd have engine failure. They would run out of fuel. Sometimes they'd get lost. They'd fly over Soviet territory and have to land. So any number of things would go wrong on these raids. And a lot of them, like I said, were scrubbed due to weather conditions. And particularly in the wintertime, when you got a lot of storms coming out of the Bering Sea, you just pretty much have to shut down everything. So really, you've only got a few months of relative, I wouldn't say even decent weather sometimes, because it's still pretty tough. And again, no GPS, no satellite. This is 1940s technology that we're talking about here. So even today, it's not always ideal, not always ideal conditions, either on air or sea. But back then, it was even tougher.
Okay, I think we've covered the areas. Michelle, do you think I missed?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, well, thank you all. I appreciate all the questions and all the great comments. And by the way, if you are interested, if you flip back maybe to the, I put up a number of books here that are. We have quite a few more as well. The library has quite a good collection of books on the war in Alaska, the Aleut portion of it, the Japanese population, the home front, and as well as the military campaigns. These are some of the sources that I tend to recommend. Some of them are fairly. If you're interested in the Japanese side of things, I would look at Japan 1941 by Eri Hata, as a Japanese historian, who really kind of goes into the sort of backward way that Japan ended up entering the war. All these books, for those who are local, are available in the Ketchikan Library here at the university. So, but they're also perfectly. You can go to other libraries as well. I'm sure they have quite a few of them. So, so you patronize your local library. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. So thank you today. What we want to do is really take time to appreciate this wonderful gentleman who has come here and shared so much information with us. And thank you for your comments that you have left during this time. This has been a really vibrant conversation that's been happening in chat throughout the entire presentation. And we just want to encourage you to keep your eye and your ear out on our Facebook page for future events. If you would like to be placed on an email list to be notified directly for future Ask UAS events, please give us a call at 228-4567. This has been a presentation of the UAS Ketchikan Campus Library and the Ask UAS series. So we thank you very much. We're going to sign off and have a great evening.